He was one of the richest men in the city, but no amount of money could fix his son. Arthur Vance, a titan of industry whose name was etched onto skyscrapers and foundations, could command boardrooms and bend markets to his will, but he could not breach the silent fortress that encased his 7-year-old child, Leo. After firing 7 nannies in a single month, each one a highly qualified professional, defeated by the profound, unyielding quiet of the boy, Arthur was at the edge of a precipice. The cavernous halls of his marble-floored mansion echoed not with laughter, but with the deafening sound of his own failure. Then a quiet maid with a painful past and eyes that held the ghosts of her own sorrows walked through his door. He hired her out of sheer exhaustion, never expecting that she would be the one to uncover a secret so monstrous it would break him completely, before rebuilding him from the ashes. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Clara moved through the Vance mansion like a ghost, a stark contrast to the string of nannies who had preceded her. They had arrived with brightly colored bags filled with sensory toys, laminated schedules, and the loud, determined cheerfulness of professionals armed with theories. They had filled the sterile air with their plans and pronouncements, their voices bouncing off the cold surfaces, and ultimately off the impenetrable wall of Leo's silence. Clara arrived with a single worn canvas bag and a quiet that seemed to absorb the house's oppressive hush rather than challenge it. Her official title was housekeeper, a role Arthur's personal assistant had filled in a moment of desperation when the high-end nanny agencies had politely requested he seek more specialized institutional care. Arthur hadn't even interviewed her. He'd just glanced at her resume, a sparse document listing cleaning jobs in quiet suburban homes, and grunted his approval. He didn't care who scrubbed the floors as long as they were invisible. For the first week, Clara was exactly that, invisible. She learned the geography of the house, a modern palace of glass and steel that felt more like a museum than a home. It was a monument to wealth, but also to grief. Every surface was immaculate, every piece of art strategically placed, but there was no life. No stray toys, no fingerprints on the glass, no scuff marks on the polished concrete floors. The only evidence of a child's existence was Leo's suite of rooms on the 2nd floor, which was less a bedroom and more a softly padded, carefully curated containment cell. It had a low bed, shelves of untouched books, and a window overlooking a garden that was as meticulously manicured and lifeless as the house itself. Clara's duties included cleaning this room, a task she undertook with a reverence that puzzled the other household staff. She didn't just wipe down surfaces, she observed. She saw what the others had missed because they had been looking for a reaction, a response, a sign of engagement. Clara simply watched. She noticed that while Leo never seemed to look at anyone directly, his eyes, a startlingly deep blue, would sometimes track the movement of light on the floor as the sun shifted. She saw how his small hands, usually limp in his lap, would clench almost imperceptibly when a car horn blared on the street far below. And she saw the horse. It was a small wooden toy, no bigger than her palm, its paint worn away by years of handling. It was always with him. He didn't play with it in any conventional sense, but his fingers were perpetually resting on its smooth, curved back. It was his anchor, his totem. The nannies had tried to replace it with newer, brighter toys. They had tried to take it away to encourage him to engage with other objects. Clara understood instinctively that this was a violation. The horse was not a toy, it was a part of him. Arthur Vance saw his son through the prism of his own anguish. Leo was the living embodiment of his loss. The boy had been born a quiet, watchful baby, but it was after Eleanor, Arthur's wife, had died in a sudden, brutal car accident 2 years ago that the silence had become absolute. The specialists had descended, led by the esteemed Dr. Alistair Finch, a family friend and a leading pediatric neurologist. The diagnosis was severe nonverbal autism, triggered, they said, by the trauma of his mother's death. The prognosis was bleak. They spoke of management, not recovery. Arthur, paralyzed by a grief so profound it stole the air from his lungs, had accepted their words as gospel. He had poured his fortune into therapies and interventions, turning his home into a private clinic. But nothing worked. Leo remained lost, a beautiful, fragile ship adrift on a silent sea, and Arthur was stranded on the shore, powerless to reach him. His interactions with his son were stilted, painful rituals. He would enter Leo's room each evening, stand awkwardly for a few minutes, and say, "Good night, Leo." The boy would never respond. Arthur would then retreat to his study, pour a glass of scotch, and stare at the city lights, a king in a glass castle, more imprisoned than the son he was trying to save. He was a man who solved problems. He built empires. He crushed competitors. He shaped the very skyline of the city. But he could not solve this. He could not solve Leo. The succession of fired nannies was a testament to his desperation, each departure another crack in his carefully constructed facade of control. It was on a Tuesday, during her second week, that Clara saw the first real clue. She was dusting the bookshelves in Leo's room, moving with her customary, unobtrusive grace. Leo was sitting on his floor mat, staring at the patch of sunlight by the window, the wooden horse resting on his knee. On a low shelf, tucked behind a row of pristine picture books, was a small, leather-bound photo album. It was clearly old, the corners softened with age. Overcome by a gentle curiosity, she slid it out. The pictures inside were of a woman with a radiant smile and eyes the same deep blue as Leo's, Eleanor. In every photo she was holding a much younger Leo. He was small, perhaps 3 or 4, and in these images he was different. He wasn't smiling in a broad, toothy way, but there was a light in his eyes, a clear and present connection to the woman holding him. In one photo he was looking directly at the camera, his expression one of calm, focused curiosity. In another, his small hand was reaching out to touch his mother's face. This was not the vacant, disconnected child the reports described. This was a child who was present, who was connected. Clara felt a tremor of something she hadn't felt in years, a fierce, protective instinct mixed with a dawning, terrible suspicion. She carefully placed the album back, her movements precise, her mind racing. She looked over at Leo, who had not moved. He was still staring at the light, the very picture of unreachability, but Clara had seen the photograph. She had seen the boy he was, or the boy he could have been. And as she looked at him now, she didn't see a diagnosis. She didn't see a lost cause. She saw a prisoner. And the inciting incident, the true beginning of her journey, was not a grand event, but a quiet internal shift. It was the moment she stopped seeing Leo as a problem to be managed and started seeing him as a mystery to be solved. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the key to unlocking the mystery was not in the sterile reports of the doctors, but somewhere hidden in the profound, misunderstood silence of the boy himself. Clara's approach was one of infinite patience, a stark deviation from the structured, goal-oriented methods of her predecessors. She understood that Leo's world was not one to be invaded, but one to be gently approached, like a skittish deer in a forest. Her work as a housekeeper provided the perfect cover for her quiet observations. She began to spend more time in his suite, her cleaning tasks performed with a slow, deliberate rhythm that became a predictable, non-threatening part of his daily sensory landscape. She would dust the shelves, polish the large window, and vacuum the soft carpet, all without ever demanding his attention or trying to force an interaction. She started with sound. Not the jarring, cheerful songs from the Nannys' playlists, but something much simpler. Clara had a voice that was low and soft, and she began to hum. It was an old lullaby, a melody her own mother had sung to her, a simple, repetitive tune that rose and fell like a gentle tide. The first few times there was no discernible reaction. Leo remained in his usual spot on the floor mat, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. But Clara was not looking for a grand gesture. She was watching for the minutiae. On the third day of her humming, as she wiped down the windowsill, she saw it, a slight fluttering of his eyelids, timed perfectly with the highest note in the melody. It was a flicker, so brief that anyone else would have dismissed it as an involuntary tick. To Clara, it was a signal. It was a crack in the wall. Her next experiment involved the garden. It was a sterile architectural space with neatly trimmed boxwoods and a single, mournful, weeping willow. It was rarely used. Clara, claiming the patio doors needed a thorough cleaning, began to work just outside Leo's window, leaving the door ajar. She continued her humming. One afternoon, a small brown sparrow landed on the stone patio, pecking at an imaginary crumb. Leo, who had been staring at his hand, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, for the first time Clara had ever witnessed, focused on something with clear intent. He watched the bird. He watched it hop, tilt its head, and then fly away. When it was gone, his gaze didn't return to the middle distance, but drifted to the garden, a flicker of something. Was it longing? In their depths. Arthur, meanwhile, remained a distant, brooding presence in the house. He noticed that this new housekeeper was efficient and, most importantly, silent. He was grateful for the absence of forced cheerfulness and the grating sound of another failed attempt to bring Leo out of his shell. He saw Clara's quiet presence as a welcome, if temporary, respite. He was unaware of the subtle experiments taking place in his son's room. He received the daily reports from Dr. Finch's office, delivered by a junior therapist who would conduct a perfunctory 45-minute session with Leo each afternoon. The reports were always the same. No significant change in behavior. Leo remains deeply withdrawn. Continued adherence to the established protocol is recommended. The protocol was a complex regimen of medication and sensory deprivation, designed, as Dr. Finch explained, to lower Leo's overwhelming anxiety levels to a point where he might eventually be receptive to therapy. To Arthur, it was all just expensive jargon that yielded no results. He signed the checks, read the reports, and felt the familiar vice of despair tighten around his chest. Clara, however, was beginning to see a pattern. Leo's most withdrawn, listless periods seemed to follow his morning medication, administered by a stern, unsmiling nurse who visited daily. In the hours after the dose, he was almost catatonic, but by late afternoon, just before the evening dose, Clara would notice these small signs of life, the eyelid flutter, the focused gaze, a tensing in his fingers as she hummed a particular note. Her suspicion about the medication grew, a cold knot of dread in her stomach. But what could she do? She was a housekeeper. To voice such a concern to a man like Arthur Vance about a doctor like Alistair Finch would be professional suicide. She would be dismissed as a hysterical, overreaching servant, and she would lose her chance to help the boy. So she focused on what she could control. She continued to build her silent rapport with Leo. She discovered he was sensitive to textures. One day, while folding his laundry, she noticed him tracing the raised stitching on his blanket with a single finger. The next day, she brought a small, smooth river stone she'd found in the garden and placed it on the table beside him. She didn't offer it to him or draw attention to it. She simply left it there. For an hour he ignored it. Then, when he thought she wasn't looking, his small hand crept out, and his fingers closed around the cool, smooth surface of the stone. He didn't let it go for the rest of the day. The wooden horse remained his most prized possession. Clara never touched it, but she observed it closely. She noticed the way he would sometimes position it to face the window, as if it too were watching the garden. One afternoon she brought a small bowl of water and a soft cloth to polish the wooden furniture in his room. As she worked, she began to hum her lullaby again. She dipped the cloth in the water and began to gently clean the leg of a small table near where Leo was sitting. He watched her hand, his eyes following the repetitive circular motion. Then, in a gesture that made her heart stop, he picked up the little wooden horse, held it out, and placed it on the floor directly in her path. It was not a demand. It was an offering, an invitation. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the cloth. She dipped it back in the water, wrung it out until it was just damp, and ever so gently she began to polish the small wooden horse. She followed the grain of the wood, her motions slow and rhythmic, her humming, a constant soft presence in the room. Leo did not move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on her hand and his precious totem. For the first time, he was not just reacting to a stimulus she provided. He was initiating an interaction. He was sharing his world with her. In the silent, sunlit room, a fragile bridge was being built, one quiet gesture at a time. Clara knew she was on the right path. The evidence she was gathering wasn't something she could write in a report. It was a collection of sacred, silent moments that told a story far different from the one in Dr. Finch's official files. The boy wasn't empty. He was trapped, and she was slowly, carefully picking the lock. The third week of Clara's employment marked a turning point. The moment a fragile hypothesis blossomed into undeniable fact. The subtle signals from Leo were becoming more frequent, more intentional. The fluttering eyelids had become a clear, direct gaze when she hummed her lullaby. The offering of the wooden horse had become a daily ritual, a silent request for the gentle polishing that he now seemed to crave. Clara felt a constant humming tension in her chest, a mixture of exhilarating hope and profound fear. Hope that she was right, and fear of what it would mean if she was. The medical establishment, personified by the unimpeachable Dr. Finch, had declared Leo a lost cause. For a housekeeper to challenge, that was an act of audacious rebellion. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon. The day was gray and overcast, a fine mist slicking the glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The mood in the house was particularly somber. Arthur had been in his study since dawn, the low rumble of his voice on conference calls, a constant agitated presence. The morning nurse had come and gone, leaving Leo in his usual post-medication stupor. By 3 o'clock, however, the fog in his eyes had begun to lift. Clara was in his room, ostensibly to clean, but her real purpose was to simply be with him during this window of relative clarity. She was not humming today. Instead, she decided to try something new. On a low table in the corner sat a box of thick, brightly colored crayons and a pad of drawing paper, all of it untouched, pristine. The previous Nannys had tried to engage him with art therapy, holding crayons to his limp hand and trying to guide his movements, an exercise in futility that usually ended in frustration. Clara's approach was different. She sat on the floor a few feet away from him and took out a single sheet of paper and a blue crayon, the same color as his eyes. She didn't speak to him or look at him. She simply began to draw. She drew the weeping willow from the garden, its long branches swooping down to the ground. She drew the little brown sparrow she'd seen on the patio. Her drawings were simple, almost childlike, but she drew with a focused, peaceful energy. Leo, who had been staring at his wooden horse, slowly turned his head. His gaze fell on the paper, on the steady movement of the blue crayon in Clara's hand. He watched for nearly 20 minutes, his stillness absolute. Clara finished her drawing of the bird and, without a word, slid the paper and the blue crayon to the center of the floor between them. Then she went back to her cleaning, her back mostly to him, polishing a low shelf. She could feel his gaze on her, a palpable weight in the quiet room. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was a test, a question asked without words. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the soft whisk of her cloth and the distant drumming of rain against the window. She risked a glance in the reflection of the glass. Leo had not moved. Disappointment, sharp and cold, pricked at her. Perhaps she had pushed too far, misinterpreted the signs. She sighed softly and was about to turn back around when she saw it. A flicker of movement. He was reaching, his small hand inching across the carpet with a slowness that was agonizing to watch. His fingers, hesitant at first, closed around the thick blue crayon. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. She remained perfectly still, her back to him, watching the scene unfold in the faint reflection. Leo pulled the crayon towards him. He looked at it, turning it over in his hand, as if it were a strange artifact from another world. He then looked at the blank sheet of paper. He lowered the crayon to the surface. For a long moment nothing happened. Then he began to draw. It wasn't a picture. It was a line. A single, wavering, hesitant blue line that snaked across the page. He stopped, lifted the crayon, and looked at his work. Clara's mind raced, trying to understand. Was it just a random mark, a meaningless scribble? And then she realized. She began to hum very softly, the lullaby she always sang, the simple melody that rose and fell. As she hummed, Leo's eyes, wide and impossibly blue, lifted from the paper and met hers in the reflection of the window. He looked directly at her, and then he lowered the crayon back to the paper, and next to his first line he drew another. This line was different. It rose and fell, a shaky, uncertain wave that perfectly mirrored the melodic contour of her song. It was a transcript, a communication. It was the most articulate, eloquent, and heart-stoppingly beautiful thing Clara had ever seen. He wasn't just hearing her, he was understanding. He was processing the sound, interpreting its shape, and translating it into a physical form. The doctors said he was disconnected from the world, lost in a fog. But this line, this wavering blue line on a cheap piece of paper, was a shout from within the prison. It said, "I am here. I can hear you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, hot and sudden. She blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. She couldn't break the spell. She simply continued to hum, her voice thick with emotion, and Leo continued to draw, his waves becoming more confident, a silent duet between sound and color. This was it. This was the proof. This was the undeniable, irrefutable evidence that the boy everyone had given up on was not gone. He was waiting. In the gray, rainy afternoon, in a room that had been a shrine to silence, a conversation had begun. It was a fragile, whispered hope, but it was real, and it would change everything. Arthur Vance's world operated on a rigid schedule, a fortress built of appointments and deadlines to keep the chaos of his grief at bay. He never came home before 7 o'clock. It was a rule. But on that rainy Thursday, a multi-billion-dollar merger he was negotiating in Tokyo hit a snag. The call ended abruptly, leaving him simmering with a potent cocktail of frustration and adrenaline. The silence of his office, usually a comfort, felt suffocating. He needed to move. On a rare, reckless impulse, he told his driver to take him home. It was only 4:30. He entered the mansion through the main hall, the click of his expensive shoes unnaturally loud in the mid-afternoon stillness. He shrugged off his coat, the residual anger from his call still coiling in his gut. He was about to head for his study and its fully stocked bar when he noticed the silence was different today. It wasn't the usual heavy, oppressive quiet. There was something else beneath it, a current of peace. It was unsettling. Frowning, he ascended the grand floating staircase, his steps silent on the thick runner. He didn't know what drew him towards his son's room, perhaps a subconscious need to gaze upon the one problem he couldn't solve, to put his corporate frustrations into perspective. He pushed the door open without knocking. He never knocked, and the scene before him made him freeze in the doorway. His mind, accustomed to processing complex data streams and market fluctuations, struggled to compute what he was seeing. On the floor, in a pool of soft light from the lamp, sat Clara, the housekeeper. Opposite her sat Leo. Between them lay a sheet of paper covered in what looked like blue waves, and in Leo's hand, held with a firmness Arthur had never seen before, was a blue crayon. But that wasn't what stole the air from his lungs. It was their faces. They were looking at each other, not with the vacant stare and forced smile of a therapy session, but with a look of profound shared concentration. There was a connection in that space, an invisible, shimmering thread that Arthur had never been a part of. A raw, primal fury surged through him. It was a complex, ugly emotion, jealousy, betrayal, and the fierce, territorial anger of a father who felt his role had been usurped. This woman was the help, a cleaner. What right did she have to be on the floor with his son? What right did she have to elicit a response that an army of specialists and a fortune in fees had failed to produce? "What is going on here?" His voice was a whip crack in the quiet room. Clara flinched, her head snapping up. The peaceful concentration on her face was shattered, replaced by stark fear. She scrambled to her feet, instinctively trying to put herself between Arthur and the boy, a protective gesture that only enraged him further. "Mr. Vance, you're home early." "I can see that," he snarled, stepping into the room. His eyes were cold chips of ice. "I pay you to clean my house, not to play therapist with my son. What unauthorized nonsense is this?" He gestured dismissively at the drawing on the floor. Leo, startled by his father's explosive entrance and harsh tone, made a small, distressed sound. The first vocalization Arthur had heard from him in over a year that wasn't a cry of physical pain. The crayon dropped from his fingers and rolled across the floor. He curled in on himself, his hands coming up to cover his ears, his body trembling. Seeing his son's reaction, Arthur's anger faltered, but was quickly replaced by a fresh wave of blame, directed at Clara. "Look what you've done." "You've upset him, all of you, with your New Age methods and your patronizing smiles. You think you know better than Dr. Finch, better than a man who has dedicated his life to this field?" "No, sir, it's not like that," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper but firm. He was communicating. He was responding to a song. The lines on the paper, they matched the melody. Arthur let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Communicating? That's a scribble. He's a profoundly autistic child." "He doesn't communicate. He exists. Now get out. Pack your things. You're fired." The words hung in the air, brutal and final. Clara's face paled, but she didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on Leo. The boy, who had been rocking back and forth, slowly lowered his hands from his ears. His trembling subsided. He looked at the drawing on the floor, then at Clara's stricken face, then at his father's towering, furious form. And then he did something that defied every diagnosis, every report, every bleak prognosis that had defined his life. He pushed himself forward onto his hands and knees. He crawled the short distance to the drawing, his movements clumsy but determined. He flattened his small palm on the paper, on the blue, wavy lines. And then he looked directly at his father. His blue eyes, so often vacant, were now blazing with a desperate, unmistakable plea. He made the sound again, louder this time, not a cry, but a single, guttural syllable. "Ah!" He pushed the drawing an inch closer to Arthur. Arthur Vance stood frozen, the rage draining out of him, replaced by a cold, dizzying shock. His son, his silent, unreachable son, was looking at him. Truly, looking at him. And he was defending her. He was trying to explain. The scribble on the paper, the woman his father was sending away, they were important. The single raw sound that tore from his throat was more eloquent than 1,000 words. The foundation of Arthur's world, built on the solid bedrock of expert opinion and his own grief-stricken certainty, began to crumble. He looked from his son's pleading eyes to Clara's face, which was wet with silent tears. He saw not a manipulative employee, but a woman who had somehow impossibly found a key to a door he didn't even believe existed. The conflict within him was seismic. To accept this meant that everything he had been told, everything he had believed for 2 years, was wrong. It meant that Dr. Finch, his trusted friend and advisor, was wrong. It meant that his son hadn't been lost, but merely locked away, and he, Arthur, had been holding the wrong set of keys. He sank to his knees, his expensive suit crumpling on the floor. The movement was involuntary, a surrender. He was now at eye level with his son. He looked at the drawing, truly looked at it for the first time. The waves, the simple lines. He didn't understand it, not really. But he understood the look on Leo's face. That was a language he couldn't deny. "Show me," Arthur whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but Clara answered. She knelt down again, her movements slow, cautious. She began to hum her lullaby, and Arthur watched, his world tilting on its axis, as his son picked up the crayon and, next to his other lines, drew another perfect wavering wave. The alliance was formed not with a handshake or a contract, but in that shared sacred moment of disbelief and dawning, terrifying hope. The order to fire her was forgotten, erased by the undeniable truth of a single blue line. The days that followed Arthur's shocking discovery were charged with a tense, fragile energy. The hierarchy of the house had been irrevocably altered. Clara was no longer just the housekeeper. She was a reluctant oracle, the sole keeper of a new and delicate language. Arthur, stripped of his usual armor of certainty, became a cautious, watchful observer. He canceled his non-essential meetings, delegating to subordinates he had never trusted before. He started coming home early, not with a burst of anger, but with a quiet, nervous anticipation. He would stand in the doorway of Leo's room, a silent, hulking figure, watching as Clara and his son engaged in their strange, beautiful duet of sound and art. He granted Clara unprecedented access. "I want to understand," he told her one evening, his voice heavy with the weight of 2 years of misspent hope. "Tell me what you need." What she needed, she explained, was information. She needed to see the history, the records, the entire medical narrative that had been constructed around Leo. The next morning, a heavy box of medical files, bound in thick binders and filled with impenetrable jargon, was delivered to her small room in the staff quarters. For nights, Clara and Arthur sat together in his vast, leather-bound study, a space that had once been his sanctuary of solitude and was now their shared war room. The Scotch bottle remained untouched on the bar. Instead, they drank endless cups of coffee, the air thick with the smell of paper and brewing uncertainty. Arthur, the master of complex contracts and financial reports, was humbled by the medical terminology. Clara, with no formal training, relied on something more potent, intuition and a mother's instinct, honed by her own unspoken loss. She wasn't looking for a single diagnostic error. She was looking for the story, for the moment things had gone wrong. She noticed at first a pattern. In the files from before Eleanor's death, Leo was described as quiet, watchful, and displaying mild sensory sensitivities. The therapies recommended were gentle, play therapy, music therapy. There was no mention of severe autism. Then, in the weeks immediately following the accident, The tone of the reports, all authored by Dr. Finch, changed dramatically. The language became more severe. Catatonic withdrawal, total lack of engagement, profoundly on the autistic spectrum. And with the new diagnosis came a new and aggressive treatment protocol. "Here," Clara said one night, her finger tracing a line on a prescription history log. "This is it. This is the medication he's on now. Risperidone." The dosage was doubled a week after the funeral, and then doubled again a month later. Arthur stared at the page. Finch said it was to manage his anxiety. He said the trauma had pushed him over the edge, and we needed to calm his system to make him receptive. "Mo, but what if it did more than calm him?" Clara whispered, the question hanging in the air like a toxic dust. "What if it buried him?" The idea was monstrous, a betrayal of trust so profound Arthur could barely contemplate it. Alistair Finch had been his friend. He had held Arthur's hand at Eleanor's funeral, assuring him he would do everything in his power to care for Leo. Could he have been so wrong, or was it something far, far worse? The true key, however, wasn't in the paper files. It was in a collection of old digital videos Arthur had stored on a hard drive and hadn't been able to bring himself to watch since Eleanor's death. Pushed by Clara's gentle insistence, he finally plugged the drive into the large monitor in his study. The first video flickered to life. It was Eleanor, her face luminous, filming Leo on his 4th birthday. The boy was sitting on the grass in the garden, a garden that was then vibrant and full of flowers, carefully lining up a row of toy cars. He didn't look up at the camera, but when Eleanor spoke his name, he tilted his head, a clear sign he was listening. He was focused, absorbed, but he was present. Another video showed him at a small pond, watching a duck with an expression of intense, silent fascination. They watched for hours, video after video, a chronicle of a quiet but connected little boy. He rarely spoke, but he responded. He communicated with his eyes, with small gestures, with a quiet intensity that was a world away from the vacant, listless child in the room upstairs. The contrast was horrifying. It was like watching a light being slowly, systematically dimmed until it was extinguished. The final piece of the puzzle was an old journal of Eleanor's that Clara found tucked away in a box of her belongings in the attic. Most of it was filled with her joyful reflections on motherhood, but the last few entries, dated just before her death, were different. They were troubled. Alistair is pushing so hard for Arthur to invest in that new pharmaceutical venture of his. Arthur thinks it's too risky. I agree. There's something about Alistair's desperation that frightens me. He cornered me at the club last night, went on and on about how the Vances owed his family some old story about our grandfathers. It was unsettling. Arthur read the entry, his face ashen. He remembered the deal. Finch had been pitching a speculative biotech company, wanting Arthur to be the primary investor. Arthur's financial advisors had warned him against it, calling it a sinkhole. He had politely declined. Finch had been furious, but had masked it with a thin veneer of civility. A week later, Eleanor was gone, and a week after that, Dr. Finch had taken complete control of Leo's medical care, citing Arthur's grief as a reason he needed a trusted friend to handle things. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a cell door slamming shut. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misdiagnosis. It was a methodical, calculated act of revenge. Finch had lost the fortune he believed Arthur owed him. So he had taken the thing Arthur valued most in the world, his son. He hadn't killed him. He had buried him alive, turning him into a living ghost, a constant, silent testament to Arthur's powerlessness, while simultaneously draining his fortune through endless, expensive, and fraudulent treatments. The investigation was over. The hunt had just begun. The revelation in the study that night acted like a chemical accelerant on Arthur's soul. The grief and helplessness that had paralyzed him for 2 years were burned away, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard fury. The man who had built an empire by dismantling his rivals was reawakened, and his focus was now singular: the utter destruction of Dr. Alistair Finch. His first call was not to the police, but to Dr. Lena Petrova, a renowned pediatric neurologist at a competing hospital, a woman known for her brilliance and her incorruptible nature. He scheduled an emergency consultation for the following morning, using a pseudonym for Leo. The next day, Arthur and Clara sat in Dr. Petrova's sterile office, the box of medical files, and the laptop with the home videos on the table between them. Arthur explained the situation in clipped, precise sentences, devoid of emotion, but Clara could feel the rage vibrating from him. Dr. Petrova listened intently, her expression growing more grave with each video they watched. She then spent an hour poring over Dr. Finch's notes and the medication logs, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with a mixture of pity and professional outrage. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice low and steady, "what has been done to your son is not treatment. It is abuse. The levels of risperidone prescribed here are unconscionable for a child his age and weight. At this dosage, the drug acts as a powerful chemical restraint. It would induce lethargy, cognitive dulling, and a profound lack of responsiveness. It would, in effect, create the very symptoms it was supposedly meant to treat." The clinical confirmation of their fears was a physical blow. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. Clara reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a small gesture of solidarity that he gratefully accepted. "He has been systematically poisoned," Dr. Petrova continued, her voice hardening. "The diagnosis of severe trauma-induced autism appears to be a complete fabrication, a cover for what is, quite frankly, medical malpractice of the highest order. Based on these early videos, Leo displays traits of a sensory processing disorder, perhaps, but he is clearly a connected, intelligent child. The boy you have now is a product of iatrogenic or medically induced illness." The central reveal was complete. It was no longer a suspicion, but a confirmed horrifying fact. The man Arthur had trusted, the friend who had comforted him in his darkest hour, was a monster. His motive, unearthed from Eleanor's journal, was now chillingly clear. It was a long, patient, and sadistic revenge, cloaked in the sacred trust of a doctor-patient relationship. Finch hadn't just wanted Arthur's money, he wanted to watch him suffer, to see him brought low by the one thing his power could not conquer. Armed with Dr. Petrova's impending official report, Arthur went home and took the first decisive step. He personally dismissed the morning nurse, a woman who had worked for Finch for years, with a severance check so large it ensured her silence, and a veiled threat from his lawyer so potent it ensured her cooperation if needed. Then he took the small white pills that were meant for Leo's evening dose and flushed them down the toilet. It was a symbolic act of liberation. That afternoon he called Dr. Finch. He kept his voice perfectly level. "Alistair, I'm making some changes to Leo's care. Your services will no longer be required." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Arthur, what is this about? This is highly irregular. You can't just stop his protocol. It could be dangerous for him." "I have a second opinion," Arthur said, the words like ice. "And I have my wife's journal. I'll see you in court, Alistair, and then I'll see you in prison." He hung up before Finch could respond. The war had been declared. Arthur knew Finch would not go down without a fight. He was a respected figure, a man with powerful connections and a carefully cultivated image of benevolence. But Arthur didn't care. He had his own weapons, limitless resources, a righteous fury, and most importantly, the quiet, observant woman who had shown him the truth, and the small boy upstairs who was, for the first time in 2 years, beginning to wake up. The first few days after stopping the medication were a strange mix of hope and terror. Leo was no longer in a chemical fog, but the world, unfiltered, was overwhelming for him. Sounds were too loud, lights too bright. He was irritable and disoriented, often retreating to a corner of his room, his hands over his ears. Arthur, in a fit of panic, almost called Dr. Petrova to ask if they should reinstate a smaller dose, but Clara stopped him. "No," she said firmly. "He's been asleep for 2 years. He needs time to learn how to be awake. We have to be his anchor." And she was. She filled his room with soft blankets, kept the lights low, and spoke in a near whisper. She continued her humming, the familiar melody a lifeline in his sea of sensory confusion. Slowly, miraculously, he began to stabilize. The moments of clarity grew longer. He started using the crayons again, not just drawing waves, but simple shapes, a circle for the sun, a square for the house. He was emerging, but Arthur's declaration of war had not gone unanswered. Alistair Finch was a cornered animal, and he lashed out with the viciousness of a man with everything to lose. His retaliation was swift, strategic, and devastating. 2 days after the phone call, 2 stern-faced social workers from Child Protective Services arrived at the mansion, flanked by a police officer. They presented Arthur with an emergency court order. The document was filled with horrifying, fabricated accusations. It was a sworn affidavit from Dr. Finch, portraying Arthur as an unstable, grieving father who had fallen under the influence of an unqualified and manipulative housekeeper. It claimed that Arthur, against all medical advice, had abruptly stopped his son's essential medication, plunging the boy into a state of acute distress and medical peril. It painted Clara as a dangerous charlatan, preying on a vulnerable family. The order stipulated that Leo was to be immediately removed from the home and placed in the custody of the state, pending a full investigation. He would be housed at the Northwood Pediatric Center, a private facility for children with severe neurological disorders, for assessment and stabilization. Arthur's blood ran cold as he read the name of the facility. Northwood was owned by a holding company that his investigators had already linked to Alistair Finch. It was his territory. He was taking Leo back. "You can't do this," Arthur roared, the controlled fury of the past few days exploding into raw panic. His lawyers were on their way, but the court order was ironclad. The social workers were unmoved. Clara stood by, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. The scene unfolded like a nightmare. They went to Leo's room. The boy, seeing the strangers and sensing the fear in the air, began to cry, a thin, terrified wail. When one of the social workers tried to touch him, he recoiled and scrambled towards Clara, burying his face in her legs. "Please," Clara begged, her arms wrapped around the trembling boy. "Don't do this to him. He's just starting to get better. This will destroy him." Her pleas were ignored. The court order was clear. Clara, named in the affidavit as a source of instability, was barred from having any contact with the child. Following protocol, the police officer gently but firmly separated her from Leo. The boy's cries escalated into frantic screams as he was lifted into the arms of a stranger. He reached for Clara, his small fingers grasping at the air, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. "Clara!" The word was choked, distorted by his sobs, but it was unmistakable. It was her name, his first word in 2 years. He said it while being torn away from her. They took him. Arthur and Clara were left standing in the silent hallway, the echo of Leo's scream still hanging in the air. The victory they had felt just days before had turned to ash. Finch had not just retaliated. He had taken their most precious asset. He had taken the boy. Leo's regression would be immediate and severe in the cold, unfamiliar environment, surrounded by Finch's loyalists. It would be all the proof Finch needed to validate his original diagnosis and paint Arthur as a negligent parent. He had turned their own evidence, Leo's reawakening, against them. Arthur felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He looked at Clara, who was weeping silently, her face buried in her hands. The sight of her grief, mirrored by his own, solidified his resolve. This was no longer about justice. It was a rescue mission. He would get his son back, and he would burn Alistair Finch's world to the ground. The separation from Leo plunged the mansion back into a silence more profound and painful than before. It was the silence of absence, of a void where a fragile, budding hope had been. For Arthur, the first 24 hours were a blur of frantic energy and impotent rage. He paced his study like a caged panther, his team of high-powered lawyers working around the clock, filing motions and appeals that were immediately bogged down in bureaucratic red tape. Finch had played the system perfectly, using the sacrosanct shield of child welfare to create a legal fortress around Leo. It was Clara who pulled Arthur back from the brink of despair. Her own grief was a palpable thing, a quiet, steady ache in her chest. But she did not let it consume her. Her own past, the loss that had hollowed her out years ago, had taught her that raw emotion was a luxury in a crisis. What was needed was focus. She found Arthur in his study late the second night, staring bleakly at a photograph of Eleanor and a baby Leo. "Mr. Vance," she said softly, entering the room. "He said my name." Arthur looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I know they didn't care." "But we care," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "And it's a weapon." He spoke. "That's proof. Dr. Finch's report says he's nonverbal. He lied. We just need more lies. We need to prove he is a liar, not just about Leo, but about everything." Her words cut through his fog of anger. She was right. A frontal legal assault was failing. They needed to attack Finch from the flanks, to dismantle his credibility so completely that the court would have no choice but to see the emergency order for what it was, a vindictive sham. The transformation in Arthur was complete. He was no longer just a grieving father. He was a general, and Clara was his most trusted strategist. He mobilized the full extent of his power. He hired a team of the best private investigators in the country, ruthless specialists who normally dug up dirt for corporate takeovers. Their new target was Dr. Alistair Finch. "I want to know everything," Arthur commanded them. "Every bill he's ever paid, every person he's ever wronged, every corner he's ever cut. I want his financial records, his professional history, his personal life. I want to know the name of his dog. I want to know what he eats for breakfast. Find the cracks." While the investigators began their meticulous dissection of Finch's life, Clara focused on the medical files. She read and reread every note, every observation penned by Finch and his staff. She wasn't looking for the obvious lies anymore. She was looking for the subtle inconsistencies, the small details that a man in his arrogance might have overlooked. She fixated on the nurse's logs. The same name appeared again and again, Nurse Donovan. She was the one who administered most of Leo's morning medication. But her name vanished from the logs about 6 months ago, replaced by the stern-faced woman Arthur had recently fired. "Find her," Arthur said to his lead investigator. "Find Martha Donovan." It took them 3 days. They found her working at a low-income clinic on the other side of the state. She had been fired by Finch, and the investigators quickly discovered she had signed a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a paltry severance. Arthur's lawyers had the NDA nullified within hours, arguing it was signed under duress and was designed to conceal illegal activity. The lead investigator, a former cop with a gentle but persuasive demeanor, went to see her. At first, she was terrified, refusing to speak. But the investigator showed her a picture of Leo. He told her about the court order, about the facility where he was being held. He told her she was the only one who could help. Her resolve crumbled. She agreed to give a sworn statement. She told them how she had repeatedly questioned Dr. Finch about the high dosage of Leo's medication, expressing her concern that it was causing his catatonic state. Finch had been dismissive at first, then hostile. He had accused her of insubordination, of questioning his medical judgment. The final straw came when she witnessed him falsifying a report describing Leo as agitated and aggressive, on a day when the boy had been almost completely unresponsive, in order to justify another dosage increase. When she threatened to report him, he had fired her, threatening to have her blacklisted from every hospital in the city. Her testimony was dynamite. It was a direct first-hand account of Finch's fraud. Meanwhile, the financial investigators hit pay dirt. Finch was drowning in debt. The speculative biotech venture he had tried to get Arthur to fund had collapsed, wiping out his personal fortune and investments from his family. He had taken out a second mortgage on his home. He was being pursued by creditors. The Northwood Pediatric Center, they discovered, was his last gamble. He was funneling patients there, overdiagnosing and overtreating them to milk their insurance companies and wealthy families. Leo Vance was meant to be his golden goose, a patient who would provide a steady, exorbitant income stream for years to come. The motive was no longer just revenge, it was a desperate, greedy survival plan. They had it all: the medical malpractice, the fraudulent diagnosis, the financial motive, and a credible eyewitness. Arthur's lawyers immediately filed for an emergency hearing. The confrontation was set. Arthur stood by the window of his study, looking out at the city lights. He felt a grim satisfaction, but it was overshadowed by a gnawing fear for his son, trapped in the enemy's camp. He turned to Clara, who was standing by the desk, a folder with Nurse Donovan's signed affidavit in her hand. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I couldn't have done this without you." "We're not done yet," she replied, her gaze steady. "We don't have him back yet." She was right. The final battle was yet to be fought, but now they had the weapons. They had the truth, and they were coming for his son. The courtroom was a cold, wood-paneled arena, sterile and intimidating. Arthur sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a team of lawyers who radiated expensive confidence. Clara sat directly behind him, a silent, steady presence. Across the aisle sat Dr. Alistair Finch. He looked impeccable in a tailored suit, his expression one of calm, professional concern. He was the very picture of a distinguished physician, wrongfully accused by a volatile, grieving parent. He was playing his part perfectly. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Judge Miller, listened impassively as Finch's lawyer opened, painting a picture of Arthur's instability and Dr. Finch's heroic efforts to care for a deeply troubled child. Then Finch himself took the stand. He was a masterful witness, his voice filled with feigned sympathy. He spoke of Leo's profound and tragic condition, of the delicate chemical balance required to manage his extreme anxiety. He described Clara as a well-meaning but dangerously ignorant woman whose folk remedies had destabilized a fragile child. Mr. Vance's actions in abruptly ceasing the medication, an action encouraged by an unqualified domestic employee, were, in my professional opinion, criminally negligent, Finch said, looking at the judge with earnest, sorrowful eyes. "I had no choice but to intervene. I did it for the boy." It was a brilliant performance. Arthur could feel the judge's skepticism towards him hardening. Then it was his lead lawyer's turn to cross-examine. "Dr. Finch," the lawyer began, his voice deceptively mild, "you've testified that Leo Vance is nonverbal, correct? That he is incapable of forming words?" "That is correct," Finch said smoothly. "It is one of the most tragic aspects of his specific presentation of the disorder." The lawyer nodded. He turned and signaled to an aide who dimmed the courtroom lights and turned on a large monitor. "Your Honor, we would like to present a video taken 3 days ago by a court-appointed child psychologist at the Northwood facility." Finch's composure cracked for the first time. A flicker of alarm crossed his face. On the screen, a video appeared. It showed Leo sitting in a stark white room. He looked pale and terrified, smaller than ever. A gentle-faced woman, the psychologist, sat with him. For a moment he was silent, rocking back and forth. Then the psychologist held up a photograph. It was a picture of Clara. Leo stopped rocking. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the photograph. "Clara," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, but the word was clear. The psychologist then held up another photo, this one of Dr. Finch. Leo flinched violently, pulling his hand back. He began to cry. No, bad man. The courtroom was utterly silent. Finch was ashen-faced. His lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting, but the judge waved him down, her eyes fixed on the screen. The video was the first major blow, a direct contradiction of Finch's sworn testimony. But Arthur's lawyer was just getting started. He brought up Finch's finances, presenting bank records and loan defaults that showed his desperate situation. He established the clear financial motive for keeping Leo as a long-term patient at Northwood. And then he called his star witness, Nurse Martha Donovan. Nurse Donovan was visibly nervous, but her voice was steady as she recounted the events that led to her firing. She described Finch's hostility when she questioned the medication, his orders to falsify records, and the threats he made against her career. He said the boy's brain was a chemical soup and it was his job to get the recipe right, she testified, her voice trembling with remembered anger. He didn't talk about him like a child. He talked about him like a science experiment or an investment. Finch's lawyer tried to discredit her, painting her as a disgruntled former employee with a grudge, but her testimony was too detailed, too emotional to be dismissed. The foundation of Finch's credibility was crumbling into dust. The final crushing blow came from Dr. Petrova's expert testimony. She presented a calm, clinical, and utterly damning analysis of Finch's treatment, calling it a systematic poisoning and a complete betrayal of the Hippocratic Oath. She explained to the judge in clear, simple terms how the medication had induced a state that mimicked severe autism. When Dr. Petrova finished, Judge Miller looked at Alistair Finch for a long, silent moment. The doctor's mask of calm concern had melted away, leaving behind the pinched, desperate face of a guilty man. "Doctor?" "Finch," the judge said, her voice dripping with ice, "I have heard enough. This court finds that there is substantial evidence of medical malpractice, fraud, and perjury. The emergency order is hereby vacated. Full custody of Leo Vance is restored to his father, effective immediately. And I am referring this entire case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was over. A complete and total victory. Arthur felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He turned and looked at Clara. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was smiling, a radiant, beautiful smile of pure joy. Finch was escorted from the courtroom by bailiffs, his career and his freedom evaporating before his eyes. Arthur and Clara didn't wait. They left the courthouse and drove straight to the Northwood facility. They walked through the cold, sterile corridors, their footsteps echoing. They were led to the same white room from the video. Leo was sitting on the floor, listlessly pushing a plastic block back and forth. He looked up as the door opened. His eyes, dull and lifeless moments before, widened. A light came on from deep within. "Clara," he whispered. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his movements clumsy but urgent. He didn't run to his father. He ran to Clara. He threw his arms around her legs and buried his face against her, his small body shaking with sobs of relief. Clara knelt and wrapped him in her arms, holding him tight, murmuring his name over and over. Arthur knelt beside them, placing his hand on his son's back. For the first time, Leo didn't flinch from his father's touch. He leaned into it. The three of them stayed there for a long time, a small, shattered family being made whole again on the cold floor of their enemy's fortress. The vindication was sweet, But this reunion, this was everything. 1 year later, the Vance mansion was unrecognizable. The cold, minimalist palace had been transformed into a warm, vibrant home. Brightly colored paintings, most of them wavy blue lines, adorned the walls. Toys were scattered on the plush rugs, and the sound of laughter often echoed in the once silent halls. The garden, once a sterile collection of manicured shrubs, was now a riot of life, with a swing set, a sandbox, and sprawling beds of wildflowers that Clara and Leo had planted together. Leo was thriving. The process of detoxing from the medication had been followed by a slow, steady re-engagement with the world. With the help of Dr. Petrova and a team of compassionate therapists she had recommended, he was learning to manage his sensory sensitivities and to express himself. He was still a quiet boy, thoughtful and observant. But the silence was no longer a prison. He spoke in short, deliberate sentences, and when he was excited, he would chatter on about his latest interests, first dinosaurs, then stars, and now horses. He attended a small, specialized school where his unique way of seeing the world was celebrated, not pathologized. The wooden horse was still his favorite totem, but now it was joined by a whole stable of other toy animals. Doctor. Alistair Finch had been stripped of his medical license and was facing a battery of criminal charges and civil lawsuits from other families who had come forward after his public disgrace. His world had been dismantled as thoroughly as he had tried to dismantle Leo's. Arthur had used his wealth not for revenge, but for reform. He established the Eleanor Vance Foundation for Pediatric Neurological Ethics, a nonprofit dedicated to funding research and advocating for patients' rights to protect other children from predators like Finch. But the most profound transformation had occurred within the walls of his own home. The tentative alliance between Arthur and Clara had deepened into a partnership built on mutual respect, trust, and a quiet, profound love. She was no longer the housekeeper, she was the heart of their new family. She had not replaced Eleanor, no one could, but she had healed a wound Arthur thought would be fatal. She had taught him how to be a father, not through control and grand gestures, but through patience, presence, and the simple act of listening to the silence. The culmination of their year of healing took place at the inaugural gala for the Eleanor Vance Foundation. The ballroom was filled with the city's elite, but Arthur only had eyes for his family. Clara was stunning in a simple, elegant blue gown, the color of Leo's eyes, and Leo, in a small tuxedo, stood beside them holding both of their hands, looking out at the crowd, not with fear, but with a calm curiosity. When it was time for Arthur to speak, he walked to the podium, not as the ruthless titan of industry, but as a humbled, grateful father. He spoke of his wife's memory, of his own failures, and of the darkness that had almost consumed his family. For 2 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes finding Clara in the crowd, I believed that power and wealth were the tools you used to fix the world. I tried to buy a solution for my son. I hired the most expensive experts and listened to the most respected voices. But I was wrong. The answer wasn't loud. It was quiet. The answer came in the form of a woman who didn't have a string of degrees, but who had a gift far more rare, the ability to truly see another human being. He looked at Leo, who gave him a small, confident smile. My son is not a diagnosis. He is a miracle of resilience, and he is here tonight awake and alive because one person had the wisdom to listen to his silence and the courage to believe in what she heard. He raised his glass. To the quiet miracles, he said. May we all learn to see them. Later that evening, the three of them stood on the balcony overlooking the city. Leo was tired, his head resting on Clara's shoulder. Arthur wrapped his arms around them both, pulling them close. The city lights glittered below, a sprawling testament to the empire he had built. But as he looked down at the woman he loved and the son he had almost lost, He knew that his true wealth, his real kingdom, was right here in his arms. It was a kingdom built not of steel and glass, but of patience, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of a found family. For in the quietest corners of despair, true sight is not about looking, but about seeing. Before we go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that.